Welcome, everyone, to Family History Today, the Center for Jewish History's monthly series of genealogy-themed public programs. My name is Moria Amit, and I'm the manager of the center's Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I know there's some people watching from other parts of the world, from all across the country, so I welcome you all as well. The Center for Jewish History provides a collaborative home for 5 in-house partner organizations that together form the largest and most comprehensive archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. In addition, the center houses the Genealogy Institute, where we assist people of all ages, abilities, and levels of experience, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, in tracing their family history. We encourage you to visit our Genealogy Institute Tuesday through Thursday, 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., no appointment needed. At the Institute, you'll enjoy free access to several genealogy databases, as well as reference books, with our librarians and experienced volunteers on hand to provide guidance and direct you to relevant resources in our partner collections. If you're unable to visit in person, you may email us at gi@cjh.org to ask for advice on your research questions or to schedule a free 45-minute Zoom consultation. Finally, to stay informed about our upcoming programs, sign up to receive the center's weekly e-newsletter by going to our homepage, cjh.org, and entering your name and email address in the pop-up box. I just want to acknowledge to thank our co-sponsor tonight, the Leo Baeck Institute, which is one of the in-house partner institutions at the Center for Jewish History. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please send us your questions and comments anytime during this program by using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Please note, however, that our guest speaker will only answer your questions after their presentation in the dedicated Q&A portion of this program. If you'd like to view the captions for this program, click on the closed caption or CC button on the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitles. This program will be recorded. Please note, however, that we correct the auto captions for all of our program videos, so it typically takes us about 2 to 3 weeks for us to post them online. Once this recording is posted online, you will receive an email with a link to watch the video. Okay, so I'm very thrilled today to introduce Roger Lustig, a Jewish genealogy expert who wears many hats. For more than 2 decades, Roger has been a professional genealogist specializing in the Jewish families of Prussia, a former region that now spans portions of Eastern Germany and Western Poland. Additionally, he's the research coordinator for JewishGen's German Special Interest Group, also known as GERSIG, and JRI-Poland's Prussian Poland area coordinator. In these roles, he has developed multiple databases for GERSIG and contributed over 35,000 records to the JRI-Poland database. And if that wasn't enough, Roger also moderates GERSIG's Facebook group and is one of 4 moderators of Tracing the Tribe, which, for those of you who are not aware, is the largest and most active Jewish genealogy group on Facebook. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Roger. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you very much. I haven't had an introduction like that for a long time. Let's see. Let's get right into this, and that would be... Okay.
It looks good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right. Let's start with business here. I have no handout, but I do have the slides for you. This is how to get them. And if there are issues that come up in the question period, stuff that I haven't covered, but feel now that I ought to have it in there, I will add a slide or 2. So the slides will be there, will always be there for you. And please let me know how to improve them too. Okay. Each of us has a surname, and we genealogists are grateful when the people we research had them too. As Jewish researchers, we're frustrated by how recently Jewish surnames appeared, and how, when going further back in time, one needs a solid chain of fathers and sons. I'd like to take you through the history of surnames among German Jews. This is more than just a historical exercise, because unlike other countries that had their Jewish populations take surnames, many parts of Germany left an extensive paper trail. Since Jewish genealogical research in the pre-surname period is far more difficult than later, having the earliest possible surname information as a liaison to the past can be quite a luxury. And since Germany has the most documentation of pre-1800 Jewry of any country, the bridge that the transition to surnames represents is that much more important. On the other hand, the fact that Germany was not a unified country until 1871 means that any discussion of this kind will be riddled with exceptions. The dozens of individual states that eventually became Germany each did it their own way. So what's a surname to begin with? The prefix sur means above, beyond, over, on top of. In other words, something aside from one's most personal name, one's given name, something extra. Surnames may be passed down or modified or replaced completely from generation to generation. Not all cultures use surnames. Famously, Iceland's phone book is alphabetical by given name, because that name is followed by a patronymic, a reference to one's father's name. Younger Icelanders have taken to inventing middle names for themselves to make things manageable as the population grows. Surnames, when passed along, are generally from the father. Not always. My wife, Juliet Beyer, bottom of this slide, descends from both male and female Beyers from Denmark. You'll note that the descent here zigs and zags a bit. It seems that in this case, the name was inherited with the family farm. So if you married the daughter of the farmer, you became somebody with the name that went with the farm itself. Now on to Jewish surnames, especially those found in Germany. Beginning in the late 18th century, Jews were required to carry a surname and pass it down from father to child. That's the subject of most of this talk, but we need to keep two things in mind. Gentiles in more places than Iceland did not use fixed surnames until the late 18th century or later, and many earlier Jews did, in fact, use a surname in more or less formal or unchanging fashion. In general, Jews and others used the surname, an extra or further name, when it was necessary, or advantageous or just convenient, and that's been the case for 600 or 700 years. We have records of German Jewish surnames that have been in use continually since the 14th century. You know many of them and may well be related to people who use them now or did then. The oldest record that attaches a surname to a German Jew is from the city of Worms in the year 1312, and the name is Treves, meaning from Trier. I can't see you folks. We don't have a display like that, so this will be rhetorically. This is just rhetorical. A show of hands, please. How many of you know someone named Treves? Me either, but we know plenty of people whose ancestors used the name after it morphed into Dreyfus. Some of the other ancient surnames we still encounter today: Gans, Epstein, Zuntz, Weil, Goldschmidt, Bing, Auerbach, Oppenheim. That's a short list of surnames used by the Jews of Frankfurt am Main before 1550. Some of those names had already been in use 100 years earlier in other towns. These earliest surnames appear in the historical records of towns on the Rhine, Worms, Koblenz, and Mainz, in Frankfurt, and in Nuremberg and Augsburg in Bavaria. Many of them were toponyms, i.e. references to a town or a region. Epstein from Eppenstein, Bing from Bingen, Oppenheim, Bacharach, Mintz from Mainz, Heilbronn, and I already mentioned Treves. But only a small portion of the Jews of that time used the surname, almost certainly because they were the ones who needed one. Someone established in a small to medium-sized town who didn't have business or important family connections ahead wouldn't have needed a surname to tell them apart from dozens of others with the same given names and patronymics. And toponymics were obvious choices if one only needed to tell oneself apart from someone in another town. It was very handy if one was owed money, and at that point, having a toponymic surname at least told people where to send the money. The oldest group of Jews, anywhere with surnames, has been using them quite systematically and with little change across generations for as long as 900 years. These are the Sephardim, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula. From about 1600, a century after their expulsion from Spain, their surnames began to turn up in Germany. Some seem to have moved up from France, like Luria, Carcassonne, and Astruc. Others with names like De Lemos and Cardoso came from Amsterdam and founded Germany's only large Sephardic community, the one in Hamburg. And speaking of that, let me depart the text for a moment. If you are ever in Hamburg or near it, visit the Königstrasse cemetery. It is amazing. It is both Sephardic and Ashkenazic. And if you're with somebody who would be bored by this sort of thing, well, it's only 2 blocks from where the Star Club used to be, where the Beatles played. So there's something for everybody there. As Sephardim assimilated into Ashkenazi culture, some of them may have dropped their surnames in order to conform or because they didn't need them. Another category of what I'd call old surnames is the rabbinic one. These were usually toponymics, that is, derived from the name of a town, usually the place the founding rabbi of the dynasty had come from. Among other things, they served as trademarks or brands, indicating what strain of rabbinic thinking one could expect if one hired somebody with that name. For that reason, as with my wife's family farm, students of a rabbi, upon marrying one of his daughters, would receive the surname indicating scholarly, if not biological, paternal descent. Sons who did not follow their father's scholarly trade generally didn't keep the surname. One of the most famous of these rabbinical names is Katzenellenbogen. The name sounds like it means cat's elbow, but it doesn't. Rabbi Meir ben Isaac took the name around 1500 after he moved to Padua from a Hessian town called Katzenellenbogen. And the etymology of that name is unknown or disputed, depending on how you wish to look at it. In larger towns and cities, the traditional name plus patronymic wasn't enough to identify someone. Abraham, son of Solomon, could appear any number of times, in a community of several thousand Jews. So some Jews combined their name with their address, the sign on their house. In a time when only the minority of Europeans were literate, street signs and house numbers wouldn't have been much help to someone making a delivery. In Frankfurt, Rothschild, the red shield at the front of one house in the ghetto, is a famous example going back to the 16th century. And we know the Rothschilds or Rothschilds came to see it as a surname because they moved house within the ghetto during the 17th century and took the name with them. Mind you, their new residence was Hinterpfann, literally the house behind the house with the sign of the frying pan. You really can't blame them for keeping Rothschild. Please note, these are not actual Frankfurt House signs, except maybe Rothschild, the Red Shield. For instance, the Schiff there is the arms of Paris. But signs much like these would have been on, on the front of these houses or hanging over the door. In other cases, someone who moved to the big city would use their town of origin, Oppenheimer, Guggenheimer, etc., and their children would often continue using it. In Prussia, the upper crust in the large urban Jewish communities, Berlin, Königsberg, and Breslau, were known by a surname by the mid-18th century, unlike most of the rest of the Jews there. That's because they were granted it was called general privilege, which was almost like being a regular citizen, and actually having more rights than some citizens. In late medieval and early modern Germany, Jews were, among other things, a caste of traveling business people. Some were hired as agents of the aristocracy, charged with making markets and moving money all over Europe. Here you see a page of a listing of Jews who attended the annual trade fair in Leipzig, some from Berlin, some from the much smaller town of Bernburg. These names were often toponyms, using their hometown again as an address, very useful when it had an IOU outstanding in another part of the world. Some of these names were for the short term only, and others hung around for generations. But there were quite a few Jews elsewhere in Germany who were using surnames long before it became mandatory. In 1743, at least 30% of the Jews in one region of north-central Germany were listed by given name and surname. The number is probably higher because some surnames may have been identical to given names, as they still are today. Here's a page from that list. Many of the Jews with surnames were living in small villages where they were one of a very few Jewish families. Were they all merchants? Was it important to identify them as related to Jews in the big city? As with the other examples above, there's no reason to assume that these were passed from father to son in all cases, but we can trace many of the names throughout the century before surnames were required, and sometimes even earlier. So how did the requirement that Jews use surnames as we know them come about? Originally, it was a practical matter. Empires needed to deal with the fact that with new territory comes new population. And in the case of Poland, new territory meant large Jewish populations. Beginning in 1772, the Hapsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia took advantage of Poland's chaotic government and appropriated much of its territory. For our purposes, the most important acquisition was Austria's annexation of Galicia, which is the darker pink in the lower central part of the map. There, the annexation more than doubled the entire empire's Jewish population. Joseph II succeeded his mother Maria Theresia on the throne in 1780. He was a reformer who spoke of bettering the lives of his subjects, Jews included, but who also recognized the administrative nightmare that Galicia represented. The betterment side of his ideas involved requiring Jews to attend schools other than cheder and yeshiva, and encouraging them to take up crafts and trades instead of being the merchant and administrative caste as they had been in Poland. Also, Jews had been tax collectors in many places, and Joseph probably preferred that his bureaucracy take over that task, not least because his mother had instituted a large tax on the empire's Jews as a whole. In 1787, Joseph mandated that the Jews of the entire empire adopt surnames. There were a few restrictions. The new names could not be those of Old Testament figures, nor could one name oneself after one's own town of residence. In other words, no surnames that would serve to obscure the identities of a group of Jews. Around this novel event, legends and stories have built up. Chief among them is that the bureaucrats in charge of the surname adoption process charged the Jews for a nice name and assigned them an ugly one, often comically so, if they could or would not pay. Alexander Bader, the leading expert on Jewish surnames, presumes that this happened somewhere, but rarely. He points out that the officials probably did assign surnames on occasion, taking prefixes like Rosen, Gold, and Blumen, and combining them with suffixes like Tal, Stein, and Baum in all possible ways, then reusing the same names in the next town with a little variation. As to paying for a better name, Bader notes that there are far too many nice names coming from Galicia for most Jews to have been able to afford them. The edict required Jews to choose a German given name as well, but I'm not sure that it was enforced as strictly in the long run. After Joseph's death, his successors rescinded many of his reforms, and that may have been one of them. The first ruler to take notice of Joseph's innovation was the King of Prussia. Ever since Prussia had taken over the province of Silesia in the 1740s, the king had used the province as a testing ground for various facets of government. Many regulations in use in the other provinces weren't valid in Silesia, nor did the Prussian bureaucracy even govern it. Instead, the king and a special commission administered Silesia directly. And what better place to try out surnames for Jews? Breslau's Jewish community had become rather large, and by 1790 included 30 families with general privilege, as I mentioned before. But there were many others in town with substantial wealth, property, and economic value to the state. As elsewhere, Prussia tried, and generally failed, to regulate the number of Jews residing in one place. In this case, they developed a system of licenses for middle-class Jewish families. These licenses could be inherited and otherwise transferred, and their number was limited to 160, a little like taxi medallions. Each licensed family received a number and chose a surname. The Breslau experiment seems to have produced good results, because it was only 1 year later that the surname requirement was extended to all the Jews in most of Silesia, and in 1794, the rest. Here we have pretty conclusive evidence, albeit from only one town. And that we have evidence from only one town because this is the only town for which Jewish records like this from before 1812 have survived. This is a transcription of the annual Jewish tax rolls in Gleiwitz, now Gliwice, first for 1790, as you see here, and then for 1791. It's clear here that the same first three people have simply added a surname to their to their previous name. And I'll just flip back and forth one more time. Just about everything is exactly as before, except that we now have a surname, and those surnames stuck. By 1795, the Prussian government had acquired territory corresponding to most of today's Poland, and with it a Jewish population about 20 times that of Silesia. Expanding the Prussian way of government and then managing large populations, most of whom had a way of life unknown in Prussia, was a formidable task. As part of this effort, in 1797, the government issued regulations for Jews in the lands newly acquired. Like those of the Hapsburg Empire, these regulations included efforts to educate Jews, teach them trades, and otherwise take the first steps toward assimilation. And they mandated surnames. But most Jews in what today is Poland, aside from Silesia and Galicia, didn't use surnames before 1797 is fairly well documented. That they did use them from 1797 onward is not, and we have hardly any evidence that they did. The one very well documented exception is the town of Lissa, just east of Silesia, but not Prussian until 1793. Sorry. Its modern name is Leszno, and given the sponsor of today's talk, I should point out that this is the birthplace of Leo Baeck. Lissa's Jews began using surnames in 1797, the year of the decree. We can see that from a pair of lists of Jewish merchants, one from 1796, one from 1797. On the first list, there are a few Jews with surnames, such as Mankiewicz, number 4 there, and number 9, Peiser. And the next year, everybody has a surname. And you'll notice that the first name on this one is the same as the first name on the previous slide. They must largely be the same people because there's so much matching between one list and the other. Even more exciting for us, the new names stuck. Thanks to a wealth of other information in the Leszno archive, we can trace many of these surnames down to the present day. Best of all for researchers, Lissa's was among the region's largest and most distinguished Jewish populations, and many of its Jewish residents moved to other towns later. At this time, there were 900 families there, 4,000 people, a major Jewish community by German standards. As far as I know, there is no evidence that Jews of any other town in the new territories took surnames in response to the 1797 edict. Alexander Bader has suggested a reason for this. Frederick William II, King of Prussia, who had issued the new regulations, died just after their publication, and his successor's government had little interest in implementing and enforcing the edict, which would have been an enormous administrative task. And yet the myths we hear about regarding Austria are sometimes told in relation to the great surname adoption and surname assignment event in the newly expanded Prussia, which, as far as I can tell, never took place. For the next 10 years, the issue of Jewish surnames took a back seat in most places to more pressing matters as Napoleon's conquest of Europe. By 1808, France had either taken over or forced alliances with practically every state in Europe, aside from Russia and the Balkans. Everywhere west of the Rhine, between Basel and Cologne, was officially French territory, and thus an 1808 decree ordering France's Jews to adopt proper French names was automatically valid in the German Rhineland and Palatinate. This decree was notable for requiring not only a suitable surname, but also an approved given name, taken from a French list that had been in use since long before Napoleon's time. I should point out also that such lists were in use until the 1970s. There was simply a repertoire of names from which one had to choose. Here we have one of several thousand surname declarations from the region. Hyman Bendit Cohen keeps his given name but uses it as a surname. For a new given name, he chooses what is probably his patronymic, Benedict, that is, Baruch. And by the way, the list of approved given names is the reason why I have a third great-grandmother named Christine. Yes, she was Jewish. No, she didn't convert. There was no list for surnames, but as in Austria, one couldn't use a town name or an Old Testament name as a surname unless one could show that one had been using it as a surname already. Napoleon's younger brother Jerome had been crowned king of the newly invented Kingdom of Westphalia, which covered much of north-central Germany. There, too, the Jews were required to take surnames in 1808, though they could keep their given names. That particular decree had to be renewed in 1812, not least because Napoleon kept redrawing the borders of the kingdom. Earlier, I mentioned an area of north-central Germany where a large portion of the Jews had been using surnames long before 1800. Most of this region ended up as part of the Kingdom of Westphalia. This is a page from a census of Jewish males, a muster list, if you wish, taken right around the time the surname mandate was renewed in 1812. It has columns for old and new names, the old ones being Heinemann, all down this page. And this page is from the town of Niedenstein. Here, many Jews added a surname. Eventually, most of them dropped one or the other surname, typically the older one. On this page, we have families named Heinemann, choosing a new surname, either Lotheim, Eichengrün, and Goldschmidt. We can guess that Heinemann was a surname and not just a variant of Haim used as a patronymic, that his father, son, and grandson all used it. Niedenstein was also in the 1743 printed list I showed you, where at least 30% of the Jews had surnames. And the true percentage is obviously higher. Napoleon and his family ruled France and Westphalia, but their influence reached throughout Europe, especially in the areas nearest to France and Westphalia. The rulers of smaller states soon followed suit in requiring surnames for Jews, and to some extent liberalizing the terms of their existence. Among these, Hessen-Darmstadt, Baden, and Lippe-Detmold. As I mentioned earlier, the 1797 decree requiring surnames for the Jews of Prussia's large new holdings did not generally have any effect that we know of. By 1808, these regions had been taken from Prussia and were now called the Duchy of Warsaw, which was indirectly under French control. Here, too, the Napoleonic surname mandate seems to have been proclaimed, but as before, there's little evidence that it took hold. As before, there's an exception. The city of Thorn, now Torun, where we have this list of surnames that were taken by 22 Jewish families. It's slightly less impressive than it may seem, because it's accompanied by a list of half of those 22 families, who were the ones who had moved recently from Lissa, bringing their surnames with them. Up until 1812, Silesia, Lissa, Thorn, and Schwerin and Arvarte were the only places in Prussia where we can even suspect that the Jews had universally, albeit temporarily, used surnames. Sorry. There we go. Napoleon had relieved Prussia not only of its new territories in Poland, but also of everything it had held west of the Elbe, leaving a rump state in dire financial need. To take part in the next anti-Napoleonic coalition, Prussia would need financial assistance from all available sources. This, following in the wake of reform measures, in other aspects of the state, led to the decree of March 11th, 1812, which not only required Prussia's Jews to take surnames, but also granted them citizenship and more or less equality with Christians. It freed them from head taxes, residence restrictions, and so on. Prussia already relied on Jews for a great deal of financing, and the peacetime movement of goods, and Jews also managed important factories. Citizenship would attract the loyalty of the Jewish population and enable logistics for the coming war, with the Jewish merchant class serving as a sort of ready-made quartermaster corps. The surname process was documented by a detailed census, and the census returns were gathered up by each province and in most cases collated into published lists. Here's one of these census sheets. We have these for a minority of the small minority of the parts of Prussia that used them, unfortunately. But where you do have them, they are, well, basically the backbone of any research that's going to combine what went before with what came after, when we had Jewish vital records as we tend to think of them. The census returns were gathered up by each province and in most cases collated into published lists. A few regions never published a list, but we have the census sheets for most of those. With the war over, Prussia did in fact put some restrictions on the rights of Jews, and it took until 1847 and the Second Emancipation Edict to remove them, but surnames were there to stay. I don't have the time, and you don't have the patience, to hear about surname adoption in every one of the 40 or so states that eventually combined to form the German Empire. I'll mention only a few of them, including some where the details can be tricky, but relevant to genealogical research. Bavaria required its Jews to take surnames in 1813, and at the same time renewed its old system of protection, whereby a fixed number of Jewish families could settle in a particular town. The books that track these licenses are a good source of information about individuals and families. We have these books for some, but not all, parts of Bavaria. But Bavaria also controlled the Palatinate, which was west of the Rhine and where Napoleonic France had given Jews at least partial citizenship, along with their surnames in 1808. When Bavaria, quote unquote, comes up in a search at familysearch.org or elsewhere, you need to determine whether that means the Palatinate or the rest of Bavaria. The protection system used in most of Bavaria was not the only law that was different in the Palatinate. There, as in the other former French territories west of the Rhine, the Napoleonic Civil Code was in use before and after the unification of Germany, up until 1900, in fact. The German Empire until 1900 had 6 different sets of civil laws. Some of them, and some provinces, were divided up into pieces with one set and some with the other. Sometimes you hear that surname adoption was an oppressive measure. The original intentions of some of those mandates may have included easier governmental control, but Jews also found benefits in them. In Württemberg, the king had decreed in 1818 that surnames be chosen, town by town, before the end of 1828. Here's a published list of new surnames from one town, published in 1824. The Jews of at least one other town were eager to have official surnames. In Jebenhausen, which is now part of the city of Göppingen, the Jews petitioned the government in 1821 to speed up the surname process because having the surname was good for business. And within a year, they were using surnames systematically. Perhaps the most complicated situation of all was that of Posen. As you'll recall, Jews in Lissa and possibly elsewhere were using surnames from 1797 onward, and in Schwerin from 1808. Vital records from 1815 and later indicate that each town's Jewish community had its own blend of surnames and patronymics. Alas, we only have fragments of the key records from Posen. Prussia had made Posen into a separate Grand Duchy, with the King of Prussia serving as the Duke. It had an arm's-length status, somewhere between a colony and an autonomous region, a little like Puerto Rico. But its residents, Jews and Gentiles alike, weren't regular Prussian subjects. Eventually, in 1833, Prussia offered Posen's Jews full naturalization with the rights and privileges it had given to its other Jews in 1812, but conditionally. To become citizen subjects, Jews had to have sufficient wealth, or a clearly profitable business, or have distinguished themselves in the war against Napoleon. And here is a page from a register of naturalizations. About 20 to 25% of the Jews of Posen had become citizens by 1835 when this list was published. We know the process was ongoing because we have documents from a few towns from around 1840 that list the Jews that had not yet obtained citizenship. Only in 1847, when Posen became a regular province of Prussia, did all its Gentile and Jewish residents become naturalized Prussians, and only then did the last of the Jews there take a surname. From the first Jewish surname adoption in German lands to the last took 65 years. Prussia alone required 50, from 1797 in Lissa and perhaps elsewhere, to 1847 in Posen, when the last stragglers were naturalized. But it took almost as long for Prussia to finish the job in all the territories that hadn't been under its control on March 11th, 1812, and thus emancipated. That meant Westphalia plus the Rhineland east of the river, as well as the southeastern part of West Prussia. Westphalia was not the same territory as Jerome Napoleon's Kingdom of Westphalia had been, but the Jews in the parts of the region that did formally belong to the kingdom had kept their surnames, and so the process was merely a formality there. For example, Minden and Magdeburg district each issued an addendum to whatever lists had been in use for decades. There were 7 entries in each of these. That's a complete list you're looking at. But other regions published lists that were full of details not previously seen. Some gave the head of household occupation, others the names of spouse and children. In this case, we get both. As far as I can tell, the children are listed in age order, though without dates of birth. Overall, these 6 lists registered an actual surname adoption or change for only 22% of the population. The rest continued using the surnames that they had already picked up over the last 40 years. There's actually a 6th phase of the Prussian surname story, but I will spare you the details for now. The last German state to require surnames for Jews was Oldenburg in Germany's northwest corner. What took so long? At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned that Iceland still uses patronymics. That was true in Scandinavia until sometime in the 19th century too, and in the Netherlands until Napoleon's time. Napoleon had issued an edict requiring the Dutch and their neighbors along the North Sea to use surnames, but that seems not to have held in Oldenburg. Jews finally had to adopt surnames there when their Gentile neighbors did in 1852. So to sum up, German surname adoption in Germany began before the French Revolution and ended after the Revolution of 1848. Everywhere in Germany, the circumstances that Jews lived under changed drastically during this time. Many of them in Prussia and the Rhineland had achieved something like equal rights. The annual protection fees and other special taxes were largely gone. Children attended public schools, with the best going on to universities, where the topics they could study were eventually no longer limited. Young men served their year of conscription beside their Gentile neighbors. Their elders served in municipal government and state bureaucracy. By 1869, the last legal restrictions that singled out Jews were gone from all the German states. Most of these changes were far more profound than the simple act of adding a surname to one's name. But that name change generally came near the beginning of the processes of emancipation and assimilation. In almost every case, the surname requirement was imposed at the same time as other regulations changed. Most of the surviving German Jewish vital records begin at the time of surname adoption, making the written and sometimes published evidence of that event an important tool in the work of understanding who our ancestors were. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was very enlightening, and I love all the examples of lists that you showed us.
Oh, you've got copies of half of them right there in the building.
Oh, that's right. All right, we got some great questions that have come in already, and I see that people are adding to that list. So I'm just gonna go ahead in rough order. Annette Weiss asks, do you have any ideas regarding the surname Teixler? This is the name of her maternal grandfather who lived in Galicia.
Okay, Galicia is really outside the main topic of
Okay.
German surnames, but that's okay. It just means that you'll have to ask somebody else, and that somebody else is Alexander Bader, of course, who published a large dictionary, really, of Galician Jewish surnames that will tell you
Yeah.
what towns these names came from and how they were derived, and occasionally a few other important bits.
Yep. All right, these are definitely off topic.
That's okay.
But if you want to
Okay, let's see.
answer very briefly,
Okay, when
two
did
people
Tsarist
asked about about Tsarist Russia and when I guess
when
when did
they
they impose surnames?
right? The answer is I think 1805, and then again in 1834 because
Didn't really
the
stick,
first
right?
round had really not taken very well. Any
Okay.
information on
I'm
Han?
gonna skip. Oh, no, you can go ahead with that. Sorry.
Okay. Well, it's on the list of on the picture of house signs that you saw there. It doesn't necessarily mean that it came from a house sign. It's a perfectly reasonable name to choose. It means rooster. And I think it was found in all parts of Germany. I know it was found in Upper Silesia. The name Han also means cock in the sense of a spigot.
Oh.
And in Upper Silesia, there's an instance of a marriage between a Han and a Klempner, Klempner being a plumber. Were surnames required for people other than Jews? Answer, generally, by the time we're talking about, yes. And they've been used for centuries. And I think the church pretty much enforced that because the church kept the vital records too. Again, the exception being Oldenburg, where they were still using patronymics up until the middle of the 19th century.
Should I go on?
Okay, question. The father of Rabbi S.R. Hirsch was Raphael Hirsch, as stated on his son's tombstone, yet his son is known to posterity as Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, even though his given name was simply Shamshon. How common was this? Are you asking how common it was that there was a double patronymic? Shamshon, the son of Raphael Hirsch. That happened in various places. And again, it's
Oh, he said yes.
it's a way of identifying a rabbinic family. So how common was it? I don't have statistics, but it's certainly nothing to be surprised by. Ah, Landsman. My family comes from Gutentag, JewishGen in Poland, and then Kieferstädtel, Sosnikowice, and I have records for them from the mid 1700s. How about that? But I have not been able to find census data showing when they took last names. Where would I find those records? The answer is March 24th, 1812, for both of those places. And the records are, well, they are in the published list for Silesia. If you go to JewishGen.org and look at the Germany database and put in the surname you're looking for, one of the things that will come up is called NALDEX, N-A-L-D-E-X, the Name Adoption List Index. The Silesian list is one of those that's indexed there. It contains almost all the Prussian lists and Lippedetmold, and someday, when we have the manpower, we'll add a few more. Okay. My ancestors came from Breslau, Upland, Hindenburg, Zabrze, and they carry the surname Kaiser, which does not seem like a traditional Jewish name. So I wonder where that might have come from. Well, it's a nice thing to call oneself. One had, in Prussia, one had complete freedom to choose a surname, only with the exceptions that it couldn't be something rude, and it couldn't be something that meant to confuse people, and it really ought not to be the same name as the local nobility has. So there are lots of Kaisers and Königs and Herzogs, dukes, and Grafs all over Germany. It may have related to something in the family. It may but again, if one could choose anything, why not Kaiser? Okay.
So it's just a powerful sounding name. Yeah.
Yes. Somebody mentioned that my family's from Upper Silesia, because we're getting question after question about that. Why would someone acquire an embarrassing surname like Tokus? My grandmother from Breslau, born 1890s. That's another story. Tokus is one of the so-called shtetl names. Shtetl was a place in Middle Silesia, probably founded by refugees from Poland in the mid-17th century, that was known for having surnames chosen in 1812 that were unlike any found anywhere else. Uko, Gomo, Corona, Laquer. There's a dozen of these straight Decro, there's another one. And Tokus. Tokus, yes, you think of Tochus, but there seems to be a possibility that it related to a Polish word for a doll. I don't know whether that's the case, but I don't think it was chosen as a rude name. There are some names we'll never understand. Over in Lissa, somebody chose for themselves the surname Pitchpatch, which means splish, splish, splash. Sure, there were no restrictions. Hello, Lou. In the JewishGen Naldex listing, it refers to a page on a list. Where can I go to see the actual list? I am mainly interested in the list from Detmold in Lippe. I think there's an online version. If not, next time we meet, Lou founded the JGS that I belong to. Next time we meet, I'll bring a copy along. Next one is, can you speak about how some Jews took names of towns? My family comes from Berwangen, but the name is Kirchheimer. Well, if you're from Berwangen, There's no point in naming yourself Berwanger because everybody's from Berwanger. So you name yourself after someplace your family used to live. Or you simply select that name whether or not your family came from Kirchheim. There's no fixed rule about that either. Lou again, any comments on hyphenated surnames? Well, we looked at some of those in the Fulda district, the family that was named Heinemann and that changed its name to various other things. A lot of families like that hyphenated their old and new surnames and then eventually dropped one or the other. That's the biggest example I can think of. Otherwise, why do people hyphenate their surnames today? There are some cases, in fact, of people getting married and the husband taking the wife's name among Jews in the 19th century. So again, the only rule is that there aren't really any rules. Number 2, are all Goldbaums or Hirschbergs automatically Jewish? Non-Jewish Germans also have names like that. Yes, very often. And there's hardly any name, any so-called Jewish name that is exclusive to Jews. Kontrovitz, maybe. But because, well, being a cantor was named something else in that part of the world if you were Gentile. But it's a vanishingly small number. And in fact, people have noted that in the 1780s and 90s, novelists who were part of the New Romantic movement were naming their characters with names like these. And they certainly weren't writing about Jews. So, I mean, in the case of Hirschberg, it's a town in Lower Silesia. And Goldbaum, well, again, there simply are no guarantees there. Okay. Really
Another Han question, huh?
Another Han question, yes. Family is from the Frankfurt area. However, this surname, as well as another name in my family, Held, is not typically Jewish, and probably more people with those names are not Jewish. Even though we identify many names as typically Jewish, though they actually may not be, there doesn't seem to have been an edict for Jews to pick only certain names. Is that correct? There was generally no major, well, there were categories that couldn't be picked, but otherwise, within the approved categories, no problem. Almost all of the names that we think of as Jewish names, especially from Germany, were more common among Gentiles. Jews never made up more than 1.4% of the German population. The single most common surname among Jews in Germany is Meyer, with all the spelling variations. The single most common surname among Gentiles in Germany is Meyer, with all the spelling variations. And believe me, there are more Gentile Meyers than Jewish. Yes, the Jews often derived that from Meir, which the Gentiles probably didn't, but no, you really can't. It's really, really dangerous to assume that somebody is Jewish because of their surname. In fact, sometimes when you're looking at a name and wondering whether they're Jewish, the given name or given names will be far more instructive. You're not going to find a lot of Jewish Sebastians. Only very rare instances of Christine, as I mentioned before. Later on, she called herself Caroline, another nice Jewish name. And what was I? I'm sorry.
About trying
Right.
to decipher if her last name is
if you look,
Jewish or not.
Right,
Yeah.
Jewish. Given names, if you see 3 or more given names, like Carl Philip Emanuel, Even though Emmanuel is a perfectly nice thing for Jews to use, and Philip is often uh, associated with five-ish. If you've got three of them in a row, it's very likely that they are uh, Lutheran, and if you have five or more in a row, beginning with Johann something, they're Catholic. So again, look at given names if you're wondering whether somebody was Jewish, and you have a name that you suspect would be belong to a Jew. Our grandfather with the last name of Schmuckler was from Strasbourg, West Prussia. I was told by a German official that that is now the Polish town of Brodnica. The German official was right. I've been there, and it's definitely Brodnica. And in fact, my wife's West Prussian ancestry comes from there. I am on Ancestry.com and JRI-Poland and have not been able to find any information on my grandfather and his parents, etc. Do you know of any sites where I could search or places which I could get help? The answer is yes, maybe. The vital records for Strasbourg for the third quarter of the 19th century, let's say 1847 to 1874, are available in the Polish State Archive in Toruń, which is not far from Brodnica. I've been begging them to prioritize putting them online for about 15 years now. And well, any year now, I'm sure they will. I think Strasbourg has two of the three registers, like births and marriages. Before that, I think there's something from 1840 to 1847. I can't say how extensive it is. And after 1874, Germany had universal civil registration, just as they have today. It's the same system carried on throughout. And a great many of those volumes survive. And that includes a great many of them in Poland. So depending on what time frame you're looking at, the information ought to be there. Again, you can contact me later on. I have guides to what is and isn't in the registry offices and the archives. So I'd be glad to answer questions like that. My family tree includes a birth record of someone born in April 16, 1871. Writes Diana Fischer-Castillon, in Großstanisch, Silesia, which includes the following statement from his father. I was born in Prussia, I am Prussian subject, and I stay in Prussia. Given that German unification occurred in 1871, I'm wondering if you can shed any light on why these statements appear in the birth record, especially since it doesn't occur in any other documentation that I have. Short answer, no. I've never seen anything like that. I didn't know of birth records from Großstanisch, specifically. It may be one of the tiny towns that's within a larger set, but I would love to hear more about that. Again, we'll put up the coordinates, my email, and so on at the end. So please let me know about that one. Okay, what about names indicative of personal characteristics, such as Glutmann or Weisskopf? Those are more common in Galicia and sometimes in the Russian Empire also. There are certainly plenty of Weisskopfs in Germany, some of them Jewish. But I really don't know of anything particular to say about it. Yes, in Prussia, you got people named Dickmann, fat man, and similar things.
I'm guessing maybe the question is about whether those personal characteristics were actually belong to the whoever it was that adopted that surname, or that Yeah.
It may well be. It may well be that it was a nickname that the family had had for a few generations.
Mhm.
Uh, again, no rules here. Wendy asks, "What do you know about my surname of Rathaus?" Um, the answer is, I know that I should look in Lars Menk's Dictionary of German Jewish Surnames, which is about 800 pages long. There is a copy at the CJH, of course,
That's right.
and in most major university libraries, and you can order one from Avateno Press. It's not cheap, but well worth it. Um, so I'm not going to go and look all of those up right
I
now.
agree. Yes.
Okay, at any rate, by the way, a question like that is much easier to answer if you also give a place name. Where did the Rothhauses live at some point? Okay. Next, Phil Schwartz asks, my mother was born in Koblenz, Germany in 1928. I now know the origin of the surnames of her two grandfathers, Adler from Burghaun in Hessen and Rosenthal from Wetzlar, Hessen. Thanks. Okay, are you referring to the Hessen-Gottermann index? I did have something to do with that. Her grandmother's maiden names are Elkan from Brünnen, Nordrhein, and Veit from Siegburg in the Nordrhein. Elkan actually sounds like a biblical name. What is the origin of Veit? Veit is a form of Vitus, the saint's name that was from the Jewish name Feitel, given name, and that may or may not be related to Feibush also. Again, it's definitely from a given name. And Elkan, just another way of saying Cohen. Yes, it's a biblical name. In most places, biblical names like that weren't prohibited. So Elkan could mean father of the prophet Samuel, or it can refer to Kahan. I believe that was the case with the composer Elkan. Okay. Laura Weber asks, what spurred the emigration of a number of Jews from Germany to the US in the mid-19th century? You mentioned that the last legal restriction that singled out Jews ended by 1869. Well, right before the middle of the 19th century, there was a horrible streak of failed crops, 4 or 5 years in a row. We know what happened in Ireland, and it happened all over Northern Europe, though not quite as drastically as in Ireland. But given the lousy economic circumstances, moving to the U.S. or elsewhere was a reasonable thing to do. In some places, emigration had been happening for a long time. The Palatinate, for instance, both Jews and Gentiles populated the U.S. quite a bit. And I mentioned Jebenhausen earlier. That's a town where, first of all, it's a town where the entire history of the Jews is completely documented because we know the day that they were permitted to live there and the day that the synagogue was sold and everything in between. So Jebenhausen, but we also know that, again, something like half the population moved to the United States, and that began very early in 1820s or so and continued through the middle of the 19th century. Again, economic conditions were better. In some cases, people emigrated after they had been on the wrong side of the revolution of 1848. An example is the Gentile, and nonetheless fascinating, Carl Schurz, who was a newspaper publisher, senator, cabinet secretary, and Civil War general. He had a price on his head when he left and was valued in other ways here in the U.S. Let's see. were surnames chosen by families or by authorities? If one picked a surname, who had to approve it? As I mentioned, there were usually very few restrictions, and people chose their own surnames in most places under most circumstances. The surname chosen by the authorities, again, it may have happened in some places, but the story of ugly names being chosen by the authorities, all of those stories go back to a single article written about 1880. And the guy certainly knew his Galicia, who wrote it, Carl Emil Franzos, but he may have embellished things, and he may have gathered up all the really weird names that he knew about. Also, some of the names that he lists as ugly aren't.
Before you continue, Roger, there are a lot more questions in the queue. I know you've already run through quite a number of them. So are you are you
You'll have to stop me. I'm not due anywhere tonight. So if people want to
okay?
go on, we can go on. Is
All
that
right. Yeah,
okay?
that's
Okay.
fine.
Okay. If one picked a surname, who had to approve it? That would be the local authorities. In Lower Franconia, for instance, one couldn't use town names, also in other places. So I've seen records where it says this person originally asked for the name so and so, but we turned him down. It was usually a town name, and in some places you just nobbled the name to be something that's almost a town name, and that most people would figure out what you mean. The example being Spangenberg in northern Hessen, which comes from the town of Spangenthal. So hill instead of valley, berg instead of tal. And people who saw that knew what the story was. My maiden name is Lustig. Where are you from? Answer, my Lustigs come from Upper Silesia, and yours probably don't. Most Lustigs come from Galicia, generally the area between Krakow and Tarnow, and some from Moravia. And there are a few Lustig families who came from the part of Germany that's still Germany. And there are also a few Gentile Lustigs. I actually met one once after he got my mail. Do you know if the name Kiva was a first name? I believe it derives from Akiba, which itself arrives from Jacob. Somebody someday has to put together a list of all the different nicknames for Jacob. It's a long list. And so, yeah, people in Prague and other places, some of the people named Kiva took the surname Kevelos, meaning basically of Kiva or son of Kiva, something like that. If you see the es suffix, very likely from Prague. Do you have any information about the name of Ottenberg and Braun? My family is of Hungarian Jewish descent, but most of our surnames seem German. Well, Hungary was ruled by Austria until the middle of the 19th century. And most Jews in Hungary, when they chose a surname, chose a German one. It may have been required that it be German. I don't know. The running gag is that everybody from Hungary is named Gross, Klein, Schwarz, or Weiss, big, little, black, or white, or Weinberger. But among the actual variety of Jewish surnames originally chosen by their holders, they're almost all German, and many of them translated them into Hungarian toward the end of the 19th century or thereafter. Next, Bernhard Metzger asked, were Gentiles required to adopt surnames pretty much at the same time as Jewish residents were in the respective regions? I think I got to that, and the answer is Oldenburg, and that is to say, upper western corner of Germany. But in most places, people had surnames for centuries. Gentiles had surnames for centuries, and bring up any church book from Germany on family search, and from the 16th, 17th century, and you will see that people have surnames. Any ideas regarding the name Windecker, from a small town near Gießen called Lich? Named after a town called Windeck? Very likely. We'll have to look that one up in Menk. Let's see. Did German authorities have a different policy toward Jewish and Polish names in annexed Wielkopolska, so Posen province? As far as I know, there wasn't. When they chose surnames along the same lines as they did elsewhere in Prussia. And again, some people already had surnames, and some of those were Polish, like Mankiewicz, who I mentioned earlier. And in the Mankiewicz I showed you earlier, yes, that family. Is Czechoslovakia outside of this talk? I am confused about the relationship of Czechoslovakia to Prussia regarding surnames. Well, the Czech part was Bohemia and Moravia for the most part, and that was part of the 1787 edict of Joseph II. So they chose surnames there and then. Hungary, which owned Slovakia, the story's somewhat different. I'm not really well versed as to the process of surname adoption itself in Hungary, when and where and how. But anyway, well, regarding surnames, Prussia was the most liberal. It started doing this a few years after the Habsburgs did it, and well, they did it all at once, more or less. They did not take 65 years to do it.
Okay, Roger, I'm gonna cut you off there, as I think there's a lot of the next questions are about specific surnames.
Yes, let's skip those. Let's roll through these. And sorry, folks, but I'm going to skip to a lot of them aren't there. Since the Nazis hated Jews so much, why were these records not destroyed by them? Well, for the reason that the Nazis hated Jews so much. They needed to know who was Jewish. And they kept records fairly carefully. In fact, the great destruction of synagogue records happened by accident shortly after the end of the war. And I'm referring to the originals of the Gatterman films, which you've probably heard me talk about before. Wildenberg, Oppenheimer, Amsberg. Please list the location of the slides again. I will put that one up.
Do you want to put that slide up?
Yeah, hang on. Where were we here? There we go. There's the slides.
I don't see it. Oh, now I do. Okay.
Okay. And now I will go back to the beginning of the talk where my email is to be found. Okay. Scroll up. Get out of here.
Can you just make that larger?
There we go.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, there's my email. And I would love to discuss any of these questions, even the ones I'm skipping over. Okay.
Roger, I'm gonna hold the line here, and
okay.
You've done
just one more here.
Okay.
That's, does the house sign you showed for Khan also apply to the name Khan? Actually, it's more likely to apply to the name Levy, because Levi's the ones who carry the water pitcher, Levites in the temple, and a water pitcher is a Khan. And you'll notice that there was a water pitcher on the on the house sign. Khan may have had something to do with the surname Schiff in some cases, Khan being a barge and Schiff being a ship, but it could also be a house sign. And it's entirely possible that somebody named Cohen chose Khan instead of Khan. Others chose Cohen in one or another spelling. Okay, so you're saying that we need to pack up now?
We do, yes.
Can you send me the list of questions and answers?
I can definitely do that, yes. And
Okay,
yeah, so
as you can tell, I'm
yeah,
having fun here.
I will send you the list of questions. Roger, feel free to
Okay,
answer whatever
great.
you choose. And if you don't hear from
Yeah.
Roger, then feel free
Right,
to email him at this email address.
right. Or
Yep.
I may just gather a lot of them together and put them in a couple of slides, and you know where the slides are.
Oh, there you go. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for listening this far, and um, I certainly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And again, I'll be glad to talk about this stuff day and night.
All right.
Okay.
With that, good
Once
night,
again.
everyone, and I hope to see you at the next program. Bye.